inviting me to participate. I think it wouldn't have been a more sort of powerful beginning to the discussion of caste and education. And I want to thank everybody who's basically started this conversation. And I do remember our friend Abhishek who opened up by saying, that I'm tense. I think that's going to stay with me for a long time. So thank you very much. These conversations need to be started. These conversations need to be started in different institutional contexts, and in whatever fora that we all can think of, in classrooms, outside classrooms, in familial domains, so on and so forth. So last year or so, we have heard the phrase institutional discrimination or institutional murders, many times. And this is again after the Rohit Brahmula case that this has emerged. And let's just pay a little more attention on this particular term, institutional discrimination or murders, because I think it sort of connotes that the harassment or that practices that happen are not necessarily just individual prejudices or individual practices or ignorance or simple privileges being acted out, but there are deep-rooted causes to it. There are certain histories to it that cannot be ignored. So as a student of educational structures, institutions, as a student who looks at shifts in policy making and so on and so forth, what I want to do today is perhaps share an important moment of debate on higher education that happened almost more than 100 years ago. That happened in the 19th century. So I want to share that with you, and then perhaps register a few observations of mine, and then open it up for more conversations. Okay, so let me sort of give an example of a very strong and early critique of Indian higher education that happened in the year 1882, and that was part of a deposition that Jyotirao Phule made before the British government, and that was a response to what was called the First Education Commission or Hunter Commission. Phule had been running several schools for decades in the city of Pune, and he was extremely convinced that education is central to the liberation of women and Dasa Shudras. Right? So he was extremely committed to the project of education, public education, because that was very closely connected to getting political understanding and liberation. And as mass education was beginning to take root in the 1857, 3 new metropolitan universities were founded by the colonial administration, largely to further the colonial logics of creating employment. Right? And then that was followed by foundation of several provincial institutions. And this was this was the juncture at which Phule is actually responding to the Hunter Commission in the as sort of an educator, as a social commentator, as a political activist, so on and so forth. Right? His critique to the Hunter Commission recommendation is extremely important, and it needs to be engaged in full, taking into consideration all the arguments. But let's look at 3 major points that he makes, because that's, I think, connected to what we are assembled here to discuss. The first thing he says that higher budgetary allocations and funding of new higher educational institutions is a misplaced priority. Right? So he actually says that the caste of pen, he calls the upper caste, the caste who know how to read and write, right? Caste of pen, who have who have enormous advantage, in succeeding in these higher educational institutions than the rest of us, right? And then he says that obviously higher educational institutions are directly linked with colonial administrative positions. So he also talks about how the upper castes have been adaptable, and that's, a lot of sociologists have talked about the adaptability of caste, right? how they have sort of strategically moved away from their traditional occupations and have moved away from the sort of client-patron relationships that they had with earlier rulers into the fold of higher education, into colleges, so on and so forth, with an eye to service and administrative positions. This is something that he brings out very clearly, sort of laying out the context, who's going to these colleges, and should we really be should we really be allocating more funds to higher education, or should we go back to allocating more funds to primary education? The second critique that comes across in Fulle's response is his very severe attack on the filtration theory, which was very popular. And as you know, that it became popular after the Macaulay, drafted it very powerfully, that if you educate a few people, and if you educate them to be, with all their sensibilities, they are going to sort of educate the less privileged. They are going to do these things to those who are less fortunate, and so on and so forth. And Fulle goes on to say that this is not going to happen, right? And this will never happen, particularly in education, because education is connected to social control. Education is connected to control over resources. So let's not believe that the upper caste, out of their their generosity, are going to sort of teach the downtrodden, because it's simply not in their interest. So let's also understand that, right? The third point he sort of talks about is a moral invocation, telling the British government that they should be spending more resources to those who are laboring classes than those who are, and those who are in greater numbers than those who are in smaller number, and who are not really, toiling masses. So that is something, a moral sort of, invocation that he makes. Fulle's critique of this particularly higher education policy in late 1800s is extremely important, because this critique is slightly different, or this critique is actually very different from the standard critique that was launched against the British education policy, but that was launched by native male reformers, right? So there was a lot of anxiety about formal English education. Because was it going to erode our traditions? Was it going to be, it was a complete transplant, right? It was a new way of learning. It was a new way of participating in completely different structures. So there was a lot of anxiety. And a lot of work has actually been done on how the response, particularly that came out of the native male intelligentsia, was to look at it as two separate realms. So I think Partha Chatterjee has extremely elegantly talked about it, that the way people understood, the way the native male intelligentsia understood, the transplantation of higher education institutions or anything else that the British brought, was to bifurcate it in two realms, thinking that, okay, we have our own Indian spiritual inner sanctum, and you have this Western different, outside realm. The Indian or Hindu, again, it was understood to be interchangeable. Inner sanctum is supposed to be spiritual, and the outside domain is material. While we access the material domain, we continue to hold on to the spiritual inner self, because it is in some ways morally superior. So we can access both, and we will continue to treat the outside domain as instrumental, while being, while holding on to our tradition. And I think that continues till date, and that can sort of tell us why we see, why we see seemingly contradictory practices in, say, for instance, scientists who do extremely, extremely high quality scientific work, but may not question certain irrational practices, or may embrace irrational practices. And one would think, how do these two go together because they're just completely contradictory. But there is a possibility, there's a strategy to actually keeping the two, right? So that was the mainstream response to this institutional sort of introduction. Fuller actually stays away from that. And his response actually is centered around the notion of justice and social justice. And he says that we need to think about our institutions keeping social justice at the core and not necessarily valorizing our traditions and not necessarily valorizing the sort of external modernity as well. And I think that's a very valuable, useful position for all of us who are thinking about these issues. Now, since Fulle's critique in the 19th century, there have been obviously a lot of changes in Indian higher education system. It's one of the biggest systems. There we have the largest number of students enrolled. It is most diverse in the sense we have thousands of affiliated colleges, hundreds of state universities, and that's where the most people, most students are enrolled. Then we have IITs, IIMs, we have central universities, then we have a small number of research institutes. Outside this sort of the standard realm, we also have vocational centers that look at crafts and skills and so on and so forth. So it's an extremely wide institutional landscape. And if we look at what happened in the early 20th century onwards, that there was a huge expansion of institutions of all kinds, and particularly historically marginalized students found smaller colleges and state universities to be more accessible and more hospitable. So most marginalized students continued to enroll in smaller colleges and state universities. Most first generation students still go to smaller colleges and state universities. So in that sense, these institutions have become way more diverse. These institutions have become democratized than the other institutions that have taken long time to figure out questions of caste, to sensitize themselves to make necessary changes. And as a result, you see a lot of anxiety in institutions like central universities, institutions like IITs, etc., that really have not taught themselves about questions of caste. Right? Now let me sort of talk a little bit about, quickly sort of talk some trends in the last few decades. First and most important trend is that there is huge emotional and material investment in higher education in general. Right? So there's huge resources, both material and emotional resources are being poured into educating one's children, educating one's community, and that is something that needs to be understood. And when education becomes such a such a place where people want to send their children, people want to send them to premier institutions and so on and so forth, ignoring questions of marginalization, history of marginalization is something that we can't afford to do. Last 70, 80 years.